is in some ways a standard philosophy talks. I understand, obviously, that many of you will not be standard philosophy students. So perhaps by way of introduction, I should say that I started as a student in economics. I did my PhD in economics, working, however, with the topic of political legitimacy, specifically democratic legitimacy, but approaching it from within economics in the first instance, approaching it using the tools of social choice theory. I'm sure you're all familiar with Arrow's impossibility theory and so on. So I found that a great intellectual puzzle, the impossibility theory, which says that there is no democratic decision-making mechanism that produces rational social decisions. And as a student, I was wondering whether that was such a big deal, whether we should be concerned about rational social choice. So that got me thinking about democratic legitimacy. I then started to look into the literature in political philosophy to help me along, try to get more insight on legitimacy. As the speaker yesterday mentioned, within economics, even though many economists have been writing on legitimacy, they haven't really done that in a way that's explicit or that would be easily connected to the political philosophy literature or the political theory literature on legitimacy. So I had to travel into those fields to learn more about legitimacy first before I could understand the positions that economists held better. I'm still interested in questions of legitimacy, but my main area of work has broadened a bit. The way I thought about legitimacy and the way I'm still thinking about legitimacy is very much influenced by John Rawls's work. One of the key contributions, I think, that Rawls made was to highlight the significance of agreement-based justification in the political domain. He was obviously, in the first instance, thinking about justice, as his book, A Theory of Justice, underscores, but especially in his book of Political Liberalism, his second main book, Legitimacy, moved into the foreground, and so his claim there became that for political legitimacy, you need some form of public justification, some form of agreement-based justification, some form of democratic justification. While I think Rawls is right about that, at least in many contexts, what we can't really get from Rawls is an answer to the question of why is agreement-based justification so important? Under what conditions is or does justification, the actions we can justify to each other or the beliefs that might be justified, take on this agreement-based shape? We can think of many contexts where agreement doesn't seem to be all that important. In science, it's probably a mixed picture. Sometimes the scientific consensus matters, so agreement-based justification matters. But clearly, it's not agreement-based justification all the way down. Sometimes it is non-agreement-based justification, some form of third-personal, that's the true type of justification that will take over. So what is the relationship between these modes of justification? Third-personal, not agreement-based justification, and third-personal justification, second-personal justification, as Stephen Dowell has called it. These are the questions I'm now primarily interested in. I think it matters for political justification, it matters for political legitimacy that we can give an answer of why democracy or some other form of mutual justification is important. Why should we not just go with what's right? Why seek agreement? Why seek consensus? We need an answer to this question. We can't start with the postulate that justification is public justification. So these are the questions I'm working on at the moment, and I'm still applying it, or still using it to work on the political context, but I'm also interested in other meta-normative questions about justification. Okay, so returning to the topic of the talk, does political legitimacy require democracy? Many, when they try to answer this question, have first turned to moral arguments. So they've interpreted this as a moral question. Does political legitimacy require democracy on moral grounds? And the answers that people have tended to give tend to be of two types. There are two types of moral arguments for democracy one can find. One type is instrumental, so they point to outcomes, to the morally good outcomes that democracy might lead to. And I have one example here on the screen from Amartya Sen, famous example. He's shown that famines do not occur in democracies. So his point was that famines are not a problem of how much food there is, but how food is distributed. And he showed how democratic institutions secure or keep the information channels open such that serious problems in food distribution, such as famines, do not arise. So that's an instrumental argument for democracy. If you have democracy, you don't get famines. Famines are morally bad. Okay. This is just an example. There are lots of such instrumental arguments that people have tended to give for democracy, and therefore as part of an account of why political legitimacy requires democracy, why only democratic institutions are properly legitimate. A second type of moral argument for democracy is, I call it, procedural. It focuses on the values embodied in the democratic procedures, not on the outcome of democratic decision-making procedures or democratic institutions, but on the values of equal freedom in some shape or form that democracy stands for. So the defense for why only democratic institutions are properly legitimate starts from some argument rooted in equal freedom. Again, there are many different arguments, and I have one here on the screen as an example. In his book, The Constitution of Equality, Tom Cristiano has famously argued that only democratic institutions secure the value of being seen to be treated as an equal. Okay? Other institutions might achieve equality in the outcomes, but perhaps in ways that are inegalitarian, that by giving more power or more authority to some. Democracy secures in showing that you are treated as an equal. So a more fundamental respect of equal freedom than in other political institutions. Okay, so these are just examples of the moral type arguments that people have given for democracy. But there are problems with these moral arguments. One type of problem affects primarily the instrumental argument, of course, that affects any instrumental argument. It's contingent. Depending on the empirical facts, the argument could go the other way. It would show that democratic institutions produce morally worse outcomes than other institutions. And I'm originally from Switzerland, and there are some examples of this type, as I'm sure you are aware, where democratic decision-making produces outcomes which are morally dubious at best. Okay, so then that would, so then the instrumental argument becomes an argument in the tools of the in the toolbox of the critics of democracy. Right? Say, look at Switzerland, terrible outcomes. Why would you defend such an institution? And people who've argued along those lines, people like Richard Arnson, who's made the instrumental case against democracy. So that's one problem. The other problem is one that affects primarily the procedural defense, the non-instrumentalist defense, a defense such as the one given by Tom Cristiano. It's, well, how important are these procedural values if the costs of making the wrong decisions are potentially very high? Okay, so that builds on the first point I just made, that sometimes democratic institutions might produce terrible results. How do we want to offset the results that democratic institutions might lead to with this argument that rests on the intrinsic value of the process? We can't just ignore the risks that might come with an institution that ends up making the wrong decisions. Think of climate change. Think of a number of examples where it seems that at least some reliance on expertise is desirable from a moral point of view, and just insisting on the procedural values might not be a strong enough argument. Okay. Because of these worries with the moral defenses of democracy, quite a few defenders of democracy in recent times have turned to what has become known as epistemic democracy, a theory of democracy that explores whether we can trust democracy to make the right decisions. So epistemic democracy, for those of you not that rooted in philosophy, the name comes from epistemology, the theory of knowledge. So can we compare democracy with other forms of decision-making, for example, decision-making by experts, and somehow defend democracy on those grounds? We see two ways in which epistemic Democrats have tried to defend democracy. The moderate version is, look, democracy need not perform worse than, say, a group of experts. And the more ambitious version, which we find in wisdom of the crowd arguments, as well as in arguments based on the Condorcet-Jury theorem, if you're familiar with that, arguments that rely on large numbers, which try to show a large group of people, such as a democratic constituency, under the right conditions, is more likely to get it right than a small group of people, for example, a small group of experts. Okay? So that's the ambitious version of the epistemic argument. Democracy can outperform groups of experts. So while these two arguments are quite different, the moderate version and the ambitious version, what they have in common, what most epistemic defenses of democracy have in common, is that they are what I call instrumentalist. They focus on the outcome of democratic decision-making, and with regard to that outcome, they either claim, look, it need not be so bad, ambitiously, look, it can be better than a group of experts. And we're more likely to get it right, to get to the right decision. That's assuming there is a right decision to be made in the political domain, morally speaking, or speaking with regard to the fact. It seems to me that there are problems with this standard way in which philosophers have tried to defend democracy on epistemic grounds. The ambitious argument the one that claims that democracy can outperform groups of experts, so in the context of wisdom of the crowd's argument, Scott Page has done important work in this context, as well as the Condorcet-Jury theorem. The problem is that often the assumptions that are needed for the result to hold are not met in actual democracy. Are you familiar with the Condorcet-Jury theorem? Yes? Okay? No? All right. So the Condorcet-Jury theorem says that under the assumption that everyone in the group is more likely than not to get to the right decision. So you don't have to be very good, but you just have to be slightly better than random. Okay? And second assumption, provided that everyone in the group votes independently of each other, then the larger the group, the more likely it is that the group will reach the correct decision. Okay? And that likelihood of reaching the correct decision increases very rapidly, so you can be fairly confident that if these two assumptions are met in a democracy, you'll be foolproof. Right? The large numbers, such as the ones we get in contemporary democracies, should be safe. Yeah?
Could you give an example? Is this just a formal argument, or can it be applied on questions of proportion or something practical as well?
So the starting point is that in the standard argument is you just have two decisions, two alternatives, right? The right one and the wrong one. So let's say with abortion, right? There is a right. Was that your example, right? What the contradictory theorem presupposes, there is a right decision and a wrong decision. Let's say, right? So some form of permission of abortion, let's suppose, right, is the right decision, and complete banning is the wrong decision. Okay, suppose, right? So then, under the assumption that everyone is at least slightly better than random, right, in getting to the right decision, and everyone's voting independently of each other, and that's a tricky one, I'll talk about it in a minute, then we should expect a large group to converge on the right decision. The problem with the assumption is, okay, so with the abortion case, now this is a very stylized example, some form of permission, complete ban. I probably think it is fair to say that some form of permission is the right decision. But so we have to assume, right, that people do try to update their beliefs about what the right decision is and so on, such that it's meaningful to say that everyone is at least better than random. Okay, so everyone must be, so the assumption is everyone must be at least a somewhat decent moral reasoner. Okay. More importantly, for large democracies, is the independence assumption. Because what happens in democratic decision making, we talk to each other. We deliberate, we read newspapers, we post blog articles, and so on. All these activities lead to a violation of the independence axiom. If people vote along the lines of an opinion leader, the result, the optimistic result of the compensatory theorem is undermined. And something similar can be said about other types of wisdom of the crowd's arguments. They rest on relatively ambitious assumptions, or they rest on assumptions that need not be met, or typically not met in democratic decision-making situations. So that's why I won't be talking any more about this ambitious defense. I don't think it works. And in fact, if we look around, we have some empirical evidence that it doesn't seem to work. Right? Sometimes democracies seem to reach the right decisions, sometimes they seem to reach terribly wrong decisions. Okay? So it seems to me we have enough evidence to at least be doubtful about the strong optimism of the ambitious defense of epistemic democracy. So that leaves the more modest defense. But I don't think that works either. And the main problem is that I think it's incoherent. And that's going to be the main focus of my talk, is to make good on that claim. I want to show why I think the modest defense doesn't work, and that if we can defend democracy, it will be based on a different argument, not based on an epistemic instrumentalist argument. So that's what I want to do with this talk. But my starting point is an example that might help you think about what I have in mind here, what might be a problem. Let's look at this case, bridge case. So there's a town considering to build a bridge across a river that runs through the town. Let's suppose that the decision on whether or not to build the bridge hinges on only one criterion, namely whether or not the bridge is stable. As it happens, there's a very well-qualified town engineer who is able to assess whether or not the bridge is stable. He's able to issue a reliable verdict on whether or not it is stable. It seems to me that in a case like this, there is no strong epistemic case for democracy. If anything, democracy, in cases like the bridge case, appears redundant, perhaps even crazy. Okay? If the town engineer says it's not stable, but the democratic vote says it is, It's not obvious that this is the way you want to go. Okay. So, yeah.
If I may ask.
Sure.
But I mean, what was before the decision
Yeah.
of what was before the expertise level was the consideration of a town to even consider the building of a bridge, and the question arises, for what reason was it even considered? So
Yes, exactly. And then we might have a case, right? And I'm trying to isolate here a case where it's not clear that on this decision, I'm guessing you agree with me, it is such a good idea to have a vote. Okay? If the circumstances are as I describe in the case, democracy is redundant. If it reaches the same decision as the town engineer, right, you're lucky. If it reaches the opposite decision, either you have lost the opportunity to get a bridge that would facilitate traffic, or worse, you get a bridge that will collapse and kill people. Okay. So, in cases like this bridge or epistemic case for democracy, okay, if you still want to make a case for democracy, you'll have to scramble around for good arguments because the costs are potentially high, right, of making the wrong decision. So if you still want to defend democracy, you will have to turn to non-epistemic arguments. You go back to moral arguments, or perhaps some form of prudential arguments, like people will comply better if they are involved in decision making and so on. So if there's any argument for democracy in situations like the bridge case, it's not epistemic. And that, I think, creates a problem. Cases like this create a problem for defendants. It should. So what's the alternative? I don't think the alternative is to just return to moral arguments. I think there's more to be said on epistemic grounds, but it will not be on instrumentalist grounds, it's on procedural grounds. And the right approach, I think, is to ask, under what conditions is democratic decision-making the appropriate form of decision-making? It's a case-by-case approach. And it is an epistemic approach because it compares democratic decision-making with expert decision-making and tries to carve out the conditions under which, on epistemic grounds, there is a case for democracy. And this case for democracy that I want to build here in my talk is, if we start with the epistemic argument, what we get is that there is a case for democracy when there is no one with epistemic authority, no expert, no group of experts, no town engineer, we could turn to rely on to make the right decision for us. So that's my epistemic argument for democracy. It's a negative argument as opposed to the instrumentalist defenses, which are always positive arguments. I will say a little bit more at the very end about the condition under which we have no epistemic authority. But perhaps just to give you a flavor of where I'm going with this, on the one hand, there is no epistemic authority when there is no fact of the matter. Think of a group of friends deciding where to go for dinner, or maybe a group of conference participants deciding which pub to go to on their pub crawl. It could be that there's a fact of the matter, it could be that there's just the best pub in town everyone has to go to as a visitor. It could be that there's no fact of the matter, it's just about seeing what are preferences and coming to a decision. So that might be a case without epistemic authority, if it's just about preferences. Or it could be that it's contested. One person says, oh no, look, this is the best pub, I'm telling you, we all have to go there. And someone claims equal authority, saying, no, pub B is the best pub, that's where we need to go. And there is no way of overcoming the disagreement, and the disagreement itself undermines the authority of the participants. So these are two ways in which a situation without epistemic authority can occur, and so my claim is that's when democratic decision-making seems prima facie justified. So these are cases where political legitimacy potentially requires democracy. So my point is, or the conclusion of my talk will be, it's not the case that political legitimacy always requires democracy, but there are cases in which it seems to be. So, okay. So, I want to start by saying a little bit more about legitimacy, how I think about legitimacy, then look at the instrumentalist conception of epistemic democracy and give a bit more detail on why I think that won't work, and then get to my proceduralist defense of democracy in the end. Okay, so I think of political legitimacy here in the context of this talk as the justified use of political authority. Political authority is, of course, a practical concept. It's a type of practical authority. We get practical authority in other contexts, not just in the political context. Think, for example, of the authority of parents over children in their care. If the parent holds legitimate authority, right, we want to say the parent has a right to make claims of the sort, it's bedtime, right, and that makes it bedtime. Okay, just the say-so of the parent makes it so. We have to distinguish, however, and the case of the parent is perhaps as good an example as any, between legitimate exercises of practical authority and illegitimate exercises of practical authority. Someone holds de facto authority when they are taken to have the power to make such claims, even if their authority is not, in fact, justified. So a parent who abuses their power over their children might hold de facto authority, the child obeys, but the way in which the parent exercises the authority is not justified. So political legitimacy is concerned with the question of what justifies authority, understood as a practical concept, in the political domain. Right? The authority of political institutions and agencies, representatives of government. So that's how I think about legitimacy. We can then apply this concept of legitimacy to democracy, where the question is, what would justify the right of a democratic constituency to make claims about what should and should not be done? And so the focus of my talk is on the relationship between political legitimacy in general, which says nothing about the type of institutions which might hold authority, and democratic legitimacy, which is the right of a democratic body to make claims that gives others sufficient reasons for action. Okay, so I said that political authority is a practical concept, so where do epistemic questions come in? I talked in my introduction about epistemic democracy. What's the relationship between practical justification of the type we want for political authority to be legitimate, and epistemic considerations? And the answer to that question is that typically practical reasoning is not practical all the way down. It can be in some cases where cases like the ones I already mentioned, where there is no fact of the matter. In those cases, we might only try to think about what our preferences are and so on. But in many other cases of practical reasoning, there will be facts that shape and should, and appropriate attitudes towards those facts should shape our practical reasoning. So that could be ordinary facts, say, for example, to go back to my earlier example, climate change, facts about how our actions are affecting the climate to the best of our knowledge. But it could also be moral facts. I'm assuming here that there is such a thing as moral facts, that we can get things morally right or wrong. So there might also be certain constraints about what we can assert in practical deliberation, which come from us, constraints about getting the moral facts right. Okay? So practical reasoning, typically, and especially in the political context, is not practical all the way down. It is fact dependent, even if, say, an American election process at the moment might give you a different picture. Okay. Not anything can be asserted contrary to that evidence we get from this process. So there will be some link between theoretical and practical considerations. That's where the epistemic way of thinking about democracy starts to matter. Okay, so now first to the instrumentalist conception of epistemic democracy, the defense that I think doesn't work. And here is, I think, a good characterization of epistemic democracy by Christian List and Goodin. For epistemic democrats, the aim of democracy is to track the truth. Okay. So just as it is for an expert or a group of experts. For them, democracy is more desirable than alternative forms of decision-making because and insofar as it does that. One democratic decision rule is more desirable than another according to that same standard, so far as epistemic democrats are concerned. So truth tracking is the purpose, or is the standard for democracy. We assess democratic decision-making procedures in relation to their truth-tracking potential. The better the truth-tracking potential, the better the democratic institution. That's the instrumentalist, the epistemic instrumentalist approach, as opposed to the moral instrumentalist approach. What's the associated conception of democratic legitimacy? Well, there are two ways in which one can think about legitimacy in this context, in an epistemic instrumentalist approach to politics and democracy in particular. The first is what Dave Estlund has called the correctness theory of political legitimacy. On the correctness theory, a political decision, specifically a democratic decision, is legitimate if and only if it is the correct decision. Okay, that's the correctness theory of political legitimacy on an epistemic instrumentalist account. But if we adapted this theory of political legitimacy, we run into a problem in trying to defend democracy. it seems to me that on the correctness theory, we already must presuppose that we know what the correct decision is, okay? And we then gauge the merit of democracy in relation to what we know is true. But then, if that's what we're doing, we're looking very much like in the case of the town engineer, right? The bridge case, where it looks like, well, someone already knows what the right decision is, and in which case it looks like, at best, democracy is redundant, and at worst, it gets you into trouble. So it seems then that we don't have an epistemic defense of democracy, we have an epistemic defense of epistocracy, authority of expert, those who know. Or if we want to still defend democracy, it seems to be, again, on practical grounds, moral grounds, for example. But if we're serious about the epistemic argument, and if we're serious about the problems that the moral argument might create, then that doesn't seem attractive either. So in part, I think in a recognition of a problem of this sort, Dave Estlund has proposed an alternative to the correctness theory in his very important book, Democratic Authority, published in 2008. Can the alternative approach that he defends in that book solve what I've called the authority dilemma? So can he rescue the instrumentalist epistemic approach? And I think he can't. So but let me first say something about how he construes democratic legitimacy as an alternative to the correctness theory. Here's his characterization from democratic authority. Democratic legitimacy requires that the procedure can be held, that is the democratic decision-making procedure, can be held in terms acceptable to all qualified points of view to be epistemically the best, or close to it, among those that are better than random. So you see the instrumentalist approach. We're looking at the outcome of democratic decision-making. We're looking at political decision-making mechanisms that are epistemically the best, that is, that produces the best, epistemically best outcomes, the most correct decisions. And he argues democracy is justified if we look at all the alternative if we look at all the alternative political decision-making procedures we could adopt, democracy turns out to be the best, or at least not too bad. Okay, so you see that how this is a modest defense of epistemic democracy that underlies this conception of democratic legitimacy. The notion that the procedure can be held in terms acceptable to all qualified point of view to be the best plays a crucial role in Estlund's conception of democratic legitimacy. It distinguishes his conception from the correctness theory. But there's a problem with this qualified points of view clause. The problem is, or the problem depends on how we interpret it. First, we could interpret it as in the following way, that we're saying what all qualified points of view accept as epistemically best is what's epistemically best. So that is, the point of view of all those qualified points of view constitutes epistemically good outcomes. But that would lose the truth tracking aim. It's not instrumentalist anymore, it's a pure proceduralist approach. And so I don't think that's what Estlund means. So let's leave that out. So that leaves us the second possible interpretation of the all qualified points of view clause, which is that all qualified points of view are those who either hold epistemic authority. 5 minutes is what you're saying? Okay, that's terrible. Or to defer to those who hold epistemic authority. And the problem should be clear. That means we've brought epistemic authority back into the picture. That means we're back into the authority dilemma. A defense of democracy of this kind ends up on epistemic ground, not defending democracy. Quite the opposite. It's self-undermining. It presupposes that there is expertise we could defer to, and so it ends up defending epistocracy. Or if, and there are tendencies of this sort in Estlund's book, if there is still an argument for democracy, it's a non-epistemic argument, a moral argument. I think Hans Kelsen, who was mentioned yesterday, saw the self-undermining problem of these epistemic instrumentalist approaches quite clearly. I have a quote here on the slide to illustrate what I have in mind. So Kelsen said that democracy would not be possible if we construed the purpose of democracy as tracking the truth about a common good. It's just not, so we're losing democracy in the process. That's just my authority dilemma. It's a different way of putting the point. Right, so then how can we defend democracy? So this is how I will use my last few minutes. We can defend democracy, I think, by thinking about how likely it is that political scenarios look like the bridge case. Okay? And who had their hands up earlier probably voiced a worry of this kind, that many political decisions will be not like the phenomenon that the bridge case isolates, but will be far more messy. In other words, there will, in many political scenarios, not be an expert like the town engineer we could turn to get guidance on what the correct decision is. And I have one example here on the screen which illustrates probably a more typical scenario of politics, the minimum wage case, where what we find is that even the experts disagree. Right? There are ongoing, long-standing controversies among economists and other social scientists about what minimum wage policies achieve and don't achieve. Do they just produce more unemployment, or do they have other effects that might mitigate unemployment plus be beneficial in other ways, etc. Now that's a case very much unlike the bridge case, so we can't just turn to the experts because the experts disagree. What happens when the experts disagree, and the epistemology, what happens when the experts disagree, and that's an issue the epistemology of peer disagreements has a lot to say on. I can't go into this here, but let me just, in detail, let me just summarize. The upshot of that literature on how we should respond when we find we disagree with others who we originally respect as our peers, as other experts, is that we need to adjust our own original beliefs. Different strands in the literature on the epistemology of peer disagreements give different reasons why that's so, but they all, or the main views converge on the claim that some form of adjustment in response to a disagreement is required. And for me, the crucial point in the context of my argument is that this implication of the epistemology of peer disagreement, what should we do if we find ourselves in a persisting disagreement with epistemic peers, with other groups of experts, is that claims to epistemic authority are undermined. Okay? In disagreement disagreements of this kind. Of course, there are all sorts of disagreements which are different, which are what I call mere disagreements, where the disagreement is just a result of one party not having looked at the evidence and so on. Leave those disagreements aside. These are not the interesting ones. But the ones where people have pored over the evidence, have compared the best theories, and still come up with conflicting conclusions. These are the interesting ones because I think we find many of these kinds of disagreements in politics. And it seems what we can learn from the epistemology of peer disagreements is epistemic authority is undermined. No one has the right to make claims about what the right decision is. Everyone has to adjust their own beliefs. And it seems to me that in circumstances like that, we get a prima facie case for democracy on epistemic grounds. So where no one is in a position to make claims about what others should believe about the right decision. No one is in a position of that. Democracy, the answer I've given is it depends. With the decision. If we're in a scenario like the Bridge case had, on epistemic grounds, there is no case for democracy. If there is a case for democracy, it will be on non-epistemic grounds. However, I don't think scenarios like the Bridge case are very likely in the political domain, though I'm sure they do occur. Many scenarios will be scenarios where there is no epistemic authority, either because a decision problem is practical all the way down, where there is no right decision, or although there is a right decision somewhere, no one is in epistemic authority to make claims about what that is, and so therefore the epistemic argument in those cases can ground the authority of a democratic body. Thank you very much.